August 15th, 1945. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto sat in the darkness with his back pressed against cold limestone, his hands gripping a Type 99 rifle that had 3 rounds left. Outside, he could hear American voices, calm, methodical, coordinating something in English he couldn't understand. His uniform was shredded. He hadn't eaten in 4 days. The wound in his left side had stopped bleeding, but left him feverish, drifting between consciousness and something darker. He was 23 years old. He'd been a soldier for 3 years. He'd fought on Saipan, survived the retreat to Okinawa, watched his unit disintegrate during 3 months of artillery bombardment so relentless it felt like the earth itself was trying to reject human presence. Now he was alone in a cave with 3 bullets and a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The Emperor had spoken that morning, his voice crackling through what remained of military communications, announcing surrender in language so formal and archaic that Takeshi had to have it explained by an officer before the officer put his pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The war has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. That was how the divine emperor described annihilation. That was how a god admitted defeat. Takeshi had been taught since childhood what surrender meant. It meant dishonor worse than death. It meant shame that would stain his family for generations. It meant he'd failed the emperor, failed his ancestors, failed the entire concept of what it meant to be Japanese. The military code was absolute: death before dishonor. Never surrender. If captured, take your own life at the first opportunity. More than code, it was religious conviction. The Americans were demons, Kichikube-e, the American and British devils. They tortured prisoners, they mutilated the dead. They were racially inferior, but militarily overwhelming, an industrial beast without honor or humanity. Surrender to them meant torture, humiliation, eventual execution. Better to die fighting. Better to take your own life. Better to charge into machine gun fire with a grenade than be taken alive. But Takeshi's grenades were gone. He'd thrown them all during the Americans' final assault on his position. His rifle had 3 bullets, 1 for an American if they came close enough, 1 for himself, 1 in reserve in case the first failed. That was the plan. That was how a Japanese soldier died with honor intact. The voices outside grew closer. Takeshi heard footsteps on rubble, heard something metal dragging across stone, a weapon barrel maybe, or a tool. Heard English words he'd learned to recognize. Clear, negative, check that cave. His hands tightened on the rifle, the first bullet for them, the second for himself. Death before dishonor. For the Emperor. For Japan. For the ancestors who'd never forgive surrender. A voice called from outside the cave, surprisingly close, in broken but recognizable Japanese. "Come out. You will not be hurt. The war is over. You will be treated fairly." A lie. Obviously a lie. The Americans were devils. They wanted him to surrender so they could torture him, parade him, make an example of him. Every Japanese soldier knew what happened to prisoners. The training films had shown it. The officers had described it. The propaganda had been consistent. Americans showed no mercy. But Takeshi was so tired, so hungry, so far beyond the capacity for heroic death. He raised the rifle toward the cave entrance, finger on the trigger, ready to fire at the first silhouette that appeared. Instead, something rolled into the cave. For a terrifying moment, Takeshi thought it was a grenade, that the Americans had decided not to bother taking him alive. But it didn't explode. It just sat there on the cave floor, a few feet from where he crouched. A can.
Takeshi stared at it, his feverish brain unable to process what he was seeing. Then he recognized it. A C-ration can. American military food. They'd thrown food into the cave rather than a grenade. The voice called again in Japanese. "Eat, then come out. No one will harm you." Takeshi's rifle wavered. He should shoot, should kill whoever was out there, then himself. That was honor, that was duty. But his hand was reaching for the can before his mind had consciously decided to move. He pulled it close, found it was already partially opened. The Americans had punctured it so he could access the contents without a tool. Inside, meat and beans in gravy. The smell hit him like a physical blow. His hands shook as he lifted the can to his lips and drank. It was cold, congealed, probably disgusting by American standards. To Takeshi, it was the most intense sensory experience of his life. He ate mechanically, his body operating on pure survival instinct, while his mind tried to reconcile what was happening. They'd fed him. The American devils had thrown food to a Japanese soldier who'd been shooting at them hours ago, had given him sustenance rather than death. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense, but the can was empty and his stomach was full, and the rifle felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Takeshi Yamamoto crawled to the cave entrance. The sunlight was blinding after days in darkness. He raised his hands, squinting, waiting for the blit or the bayonet or whatever torture the Americans had planned. Instead, hands, gentle hands, took his rifle, helped him to his feet, guided him toward a medical station where an American doctor with kind eyes began examining his wound while speaking soft words in English that Takeshi couldn't understand but whose tone was unmistakable. Concern, professionalism, basic human compassion. And Takeshi Yamamoto, who'd been prepared to die rather than surrender, who'd been taught his entire life that Americans were monsters without humanity or mercy, began to cry. Not from pain or fear or relief, but from the complete collapse of everything he'd been told about the enemy. From the terrible realization that he'd been lied to about something so fundamental that its falsehood unraveled everything else he'd been taught to believe. To understand Takeshi's breakdown, you need to understand what every Japanese soldier had been taught about capture and surrender. The Imperial Japanese military operated under Senjin-kun, the Code of Battlefield Conduct issued in 1941, which explicitly stated never suffer the shame of being taken alive as a prisoner. This wasn't metaphorical, it was absolute. Surrender wasn't just discouraged, it was presented as a fate worse than death, a dishonor that would corrupt your family, your village, your entire ancestral line. Soldiers were expected to fight until killed or to take their own lives rather than be captured. This code was reinforced by propaganda that depicted Americans and British as subhuman monsters. Training films showed alleged atrocities committed against Japanese prisoners, torture, mutilation, execution. Soldiers were told that Western troops gave no quarter, that surrender meant prolonged suffering before eventual death, that the merciful option was to die fighting or by your own hand. The propaganda wasn't entirely fabricated from nothing. There had been incidents. Pacific combat was brutal. Racial hatred was real on both sides, and atrocities occurred. But Japanese military leadership systematically exaggerated these incidents to create a comprehensive narrative that Western troops were racially inferior beings whose industrial might couldn't compensate for their lack of honor or humanity, and that Japanese soldiers must never allow themselves to fall into their hands. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because Japanese soldiers were taught that death was preferable to capture, they fought with suicidal intensity. They launched banzai charges. They hid in caves and fought to the last man. They strapped explosives to themselves and dove under tanks. They killed themselves rather than surrender and encouraged civilians to do the same. The result? Relatively few Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner during most of the Pacific War. Those who were captured were often wounded to the point of unconsciousness or so isolated and desperate they could no longer follow the code. By 1945, total Japanese POWs in Allied custody numbered only around 35,000, a tiny fraction compared to the millions of German and Italian prisoners held by the Allies.
But that changed in the war's final months. As Japan's position became hopeless
As atomic bombs fell and the Soviet Union entered the war, and the emperor himself announced surrender, suddenly thousands of Japanese soldiers faced the choice Takeshi had faced: death, according to the code, or surrender and face whatever came next. Most chose surrender, and what came next shattered everything they'd been taught to believe. The first hours, processing the unthinkable. Takeshi was taken to a temporary POW collection point the Americans had established in a captured school building. He walked there in a daze, supported by a medic who kept checking his wound and offering him water from a canteen. Other Japanese soldiers were there, hundreds of them, gathered in a courtyard, all with the same shell-shocked expression of men whose reality had just collapsed. An American officer stood on a platform, speaking through a Japanese-American translator. His message was simple: "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. You will not be harmed. You will receive food, medical care, and shelter. You will be allowed to write letters to your families. You will be returned to Japan when arrangements are made." The Japanese soldiers stood in stunned silence. Some were crying. Others stared at nothing, their minds unable to process what they were hearing. Several had tried to kill themselves in the moments after surrender, cut their throats with broken glass, stabbed themselves with sharpened bamboo, and were now bandaged, alive, despite their attempts to follow the code. Takeshi looked around at his fellow prisoners and recognized in their faces what he felt in his own chest: a vast, disorienting confusion. They'd been prepared for torture, for mockery, for the cruelty that demons inflicted on those foolish enough to surrender to them. Instead, they were being offered medical care and correspondence with families and treatment according to international law most of them had never heard of. Food was distributed. More sea rations, plus rice requisitioned from Japanese stockpiles, plus vegetables the Americans had somehow acquired. It wasn't plentiful, but it was regular, predictable, sufficient. Takeshi ate slowly, watching the American guards who stood at the perimeter. They held rifles but didn't point them threateningly. They looked bored, tired, going through routine motions of a job they'd done before. One was smoking a cigarette and reading a magazine. Another was writing a letter, his rifle propped against a wall behind him. They didn't look like demons. They looked like tired young men who wanted to go home. That night, Takeshi lay on a blanket in a room with 40 other Japanese prisoners. They'd been given space to sleep, not cells, just a cleared room with blankets distributed evenly. No bars, no chains, just guards at the door who'd been instructed to prevent escapes, but who otherwise left the prisoners alone. In the darkness, men wept. Others prayed quietly. A few whispered conversations trying to make sense of what had happened. An older soldier, a sergeant who'd fought since Manchuria, said in a voice raw with despair, "We have dishonored ourselves. We should be dead. We are ghosts now. Not human, not Japanese, just ghosts waiting for judgment." But another voice, younger, responded, "If we're ghosts, why did they feed us? Why do they care for our wounds? Demons don't heal their victims." Silence. No one had an answer. Because the Americans' behavior didn't fit any category the imperial military had prepared them for. They weren't the monsters of propaganda. But if they weren't monsters, what did that make the war? What did that make Japan's cause? What did that make the 3 years Takeshi had spent fighting, the friends he'd watched die, the certainty he'd carried that death was preferable to this? Takeshi stared at the ceiling and felt something inside him beginning to crack. Not breaking cleanly, but fracturing in ways he couldn't control or predict. Everything he'd built his identity on was shifting, and he didn't know what would be left when the shifting stopped. The interrogation. Unexpected dignity. The next day, Takeshi was called for interrogation. He expected this. Prisoners were interrogated for intelligence. He'd been trained to resist, give only name, rank, and serial number, reveal nothing of value, accept torture as the price of loyalty. But the interrogation room wasn't a torture chamber. It was a regular office in the school building, with a desk and 2 chairs and a window that looked out on Okinawan countryside. An American intelligence officer sat across from him, a man in his 30s with patient eyes with a Nisei translator beside him. The officer introduced himself as Captain James Richardson. He offered Takeshi water, asked if his wound was being properly treated, inquired about whether he needed anything. Then he said, through the translator, "I'm going to ask you some questions. You don't have to answer them. I know your training says to resist. That's fine. But I need to explain something first. The war is over. Your emperor has surrendered. We're not asking these questions to harm Japan. We're asking to help process prisoners efficiently and reunite you with your families when possible."
Takeshi said nothing, gave his name, rank, unit number. Nothing else. Captain Richardson nodded. "That's fine. Let me tell you what we already know, so you understand I'm not trying to trick you into revealing secrets." He proceeded to lay out detailed knowledge of Japanese defensive positions, unit deployments, command structures. Information that could only have come from documents captured when Okinawa fell. "See," Richardson said, "we don't need intelligence from you. The fighting's over. What I actually want is to understand you, why you fought the way you did, what you were told about us, what you expected when you surrendered." This question, so personal, so unexpected, caught Takeshi off guard. He found himself answering in halting Japanese while the Nisei translated, "We were told you torture prisoners, that you are demons without honor, that death is better than surrender to you." Richardson listened with genuine interest. "And now that you've surrendered, what do you think now?" Takeshi struggled for words. "I don't know. You fed me. You treated my wound. You speak to me like I'm human. This is not what we were told."
But they don't seem weak. They seem disciplined, organized, sure of themselves, in a way that doesn't require constant assertion. They don't need to prove they're strong, because they simply are strong. And their strength includes the ability to be kind to enemies. I'm beginning to understand we were lied to about everything. Not small lies, fundamental inversions of truth. We were told surrender was worse than death. But death is just ending. Surrender is continuing, having to face what comes next, having to reconcile what you believed with what is actually true. I don't know if I can face this. Don't know if I can carry this knowledge. But I'm alive, and I have no choice but to face it. In September 1945, Takeshi and several hundred other Japanese POWs were transported to the United States. They boarded a military transport ship in Okinawa, were given clean uniforms, American-issued with PW stenciled on the back, and were assigned bunks below deck. The journey would take 2 weeks. Takeshi spent those weeks in a state of psychological suspension. He was traveling to America, the heart of the enemy nation, the place he'd been taught was decadent and corrupt, teetering on the edge of racial collapse. He expected to find cities ruined by war, populations starving, the chaos the Japanese propaganda had promised was inevitable in a democracy that mixed races and allowed individual freedom. Instead, when the ship docked in San Francisco Bay, he saw a city gleaming in morning sun. Intact buildings, busy ports, ships and cars and industrial activity humming at a scale that made Japan's pre-war economy seem quaint. The war hadn't touched America the way it had touched Japan, not even close. They were processed through Angel Island, then loaded onto trains heading east. Takeshi was assigned to Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, one of several camps housing Japanese POWs on American soil. The train ride took 3 days, and for 3 days, Takeshi stared out windows at an American landscape that bore no resemblance to what he had expected. Endless farmland, more productive than anything in Japan. Towns and cities intact, prosperous, showing no signs of wartime damage. People going about ordinary lives, shopping, working, children playing in yards. Factories running at full capacity, roads smooth and well-maintained, everything functioning with the casual efficiency of a society so wealthy it didn't even have to think about basics like food or infrastructure. One of the guards, a young soldier from Ohio named Private Morrison, sat near Takeshi during the journey and tried to make conversation through gestures and a few Japanese phrases he'd picked up. He showed Takeshi photographs of his family, parents, siblings, a girlfriend he planned to marry when he got home. Just an ordinary American kid drafted into war, doing his job, looking forward to civilian life. Morrison offered Takeshi a chocolate bar from his ration, just handed it over with a smile, expecting nothing in return. Takeshi accepted it, stunned. He'd been taught Americans were greedy, selfish, incapable of generosity. But this young man was sharing his personal ration with a prisoner who'd been fighting to kill Americans months ago. That chocolate bar broke something in Takeshi. Not dramatically, just a small internal fracture, another crack in the foundation of belief he'd built his life on. He ate it slowly, tasting sweetness he hadn't experienced in years, and thought about what it meant that enemies could be kind. What it meant that the American soldier guarding him was just a kid who wanted to go home, not that different from Takeshi himself. Camp McCoy was nothing like Takeshi had imagined a prison would be. It was enormous, over 5,000 Japanese POWs by the time Takeshi arrived. Rows of barracks, mess halls, recreation facilities, even areas set aside for gardens and crafts. The fence was there, yes, and guard towers and regulations, but within those boundaries, the camp operated almost like a small town. The Japanese prisoners were organized into companies with elected representatives. They were given work assignments, forestry, maintenance, agriculture, and paid for their labor. They received mail from Japan when censors permitted. They were allowed to practice their religion, celebrate their holidays, maintain their culture. American authorities even allowed them to organize classes, teaching English, mathematics, history, anything that might help them transition back to civilian life. The food was adequate, not luxurious, but regular, nutritious, more than Japanese civilians were getting back home. Medical care was available, dental care, mental health services for those struggling with depression or trauma. The camp had a library with Japanese books, sports equipment, musical instruments. It was, by any objective measure, better conditions than most Japanese civilians were experiencing in occupied Japan. And that fact ate at Takeshi like acid. He'd been taught that Japanese suffering was noble, that hardship built character, that the American focus on comfort and material well-being was weakness, decadence, a sign of cultural decay. But here in this prison camp, he was living better than he'd lived as a soldier in the Imperial Army, better than his family was living in devastated Japan, better than he'd probably live if he returned home tomorrow. The Americans weren't maintaining these conditions out of cruelty. They weren't taunting prisoners with abundance. This was just their baseline. This was how they treated people, even enemies, even prisoners. They had such excess capacity that comfortable prison camps didn't strain their resources.
Takeshi wrote in his journal, October 1945, "I've been at Camp McCoy for a month. Every day I expect conditions to worsen, for the Americans to reveal their true nature,
to drop the facade and show the cruelty we were promised. But every day is like the last. Adequate food, medical care, work that's tiring but not brutal, evenings free for reading or recreation. Some of the other prisoners cling to the old beliefs. They say this is temporary, a trick to make us complacent. They perform secret ceremonies honoring the emperor, whisper about duty and honor and how we failed. They refuse to participate in American programs, refuse to learn English, refuse to accept that the code was wrong. But others, myself included, are beginning to question everything. We compare notes on what we were told versus what we've experienced. We realize the propaganda wasn't just exaggerated, it was inverted. We were told Americans were weak, but they defeated us completely. We were told they had no honor, but they treat us better than our own officers did. We were told they were culturally inferior, but they've built a civilization that functions at a level we never achieved. I'm learning that what we called Japanese spirit was often just brutality disguised as discipline. What we called honor was often just obedience to authority without question. What we called strength was often just the willingness to die for causes we never examined. The Americans demonstrate actual strength, the strength to be kind to enemies, to maintain principles even when convenient to abandon them, to build systems that work rather than systems that simply demand sacrifice. I don't know what to do with this knowledge, don't know how to return to Japan carrying the truth that everything we believed was backwards. December 25th, 1945. Camp McCoy held a Christmas celebration. The Americans had arranged for extra rations, decorations, a visit from a local church choir. It was their holiday, their holy day, and the Japanese prisoners expected to be excluded, at best ignored, at worst reminded that they were prisoners who didn't deserve to participate in American celebrations. Instead, they were invited. The mess hall was decorated with pine branches and paper decorations the Americans had helped Japanese prisoners make. There was a Christmas tree, an actual pine tree cut from Wisconsin forests, strung with lights powered by generators. The meal was special: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pies for dessert. More food than Takeshi had seen in one place since before the war. And the church choir came, local Wisconsin families who'd driven to the camp to sing for prisoners. They sang carols in English: Silent Night, Joy to the World, O Come All Ye Faithful. The music was beautiful, the harmonies complex and moving in ways Takeshi's musical training let him appreciate even without understanding the words. Then something extraordinary happened. An elderly woman from the choir, her name was Mrs. Henderson, Takeshi would later learn, stepped forward and sang Silent Night in Japanese. She'd learned it phonetically, probably spent hours practicing, just so she could offer this gift to prisoners who were far from home on a holiday they didn't celebrate, but whose loneliness they certainly felt. Her pronunciation was imperfect. Her accent was thick. But she sang with genuine warmth, with the clear intention of offering comfort rather than demonstrating superiority. Takeshi wept. He wasn't alone. Throughout the mess hall, Japanese prisoners were crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming experience of being treated with such unexpected kindness, of being seen as humans deserving of comfort rather than enemies deserving only custody. After the performance, Mrs. Henderson and the other choir members stayed to talk with prisoners through translators. They asked about Japan, about families, about hopes for the future. They shared photographs of their own sons and husbands who'd served in the Pacific, some of whom hadn't come home. They spoke about grief and loss and the hope that this war would be the last, that future generations wouldn't have to experience what both sides had endured. One choir member, a farmer named Mr. Peterson, whose son had died at Iwo Jima, approached Takeshi specifically. Through a translator, he said, "I lost my boy fighting Japanese soldiers. I could hate you for that. Part of me does. But I also know you're someone's son, someone's brother. And I know that hating you won't bring my boy back. So I came here today to sing for you, because I'm trying to learn to see enemies as people. It's hard. Maybe the hardest thing I'll ever do. But Jesus commanded it, so I'm trying." Takeshi bowed deeply, the formal Japanese bow of profound respect, and said through the translator, "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry for the war. I'm sorry I'm alive when your son is dead. I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it. It's changing how I see everything." That night, Takeshi wrote what would become the longest entry in his journal. December 25th, 1945. Today, American Christians sang to me in Japanese. An American father whose son died fighting Japan told me he's trying not to hate me. An entire community came to a prison camp to share their holiday with enemies. I've been taught that American culture is shallow, materialistic, without spiritual depth, that Christianity is a weak religion for weak people, that Japan's Shinto traditions are superior, our connection to ancestors and emperor more profound than anything the West could understand. But tonight I witnessed something that contradicts everything I've been taught. I witnessed people choosing compassion over vengeance, choosing to see enemies as humans, choosing to practice their faith even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. Mr. Peterson lost his son to Japanese soldiers. He has every right to hate me, to want revenge, to celebrate my imprisonment. Instead, he came here to tell me he's trying not to hate, trying to see me as someone's son, trying to follow religious teachings that command love even for enemies.
This is strength I didn't know existed. Not the strength to kill or die, that's easy, we all learned that. But the strength to forgive, to show mercy, to maintain principles when every instinct screams for revenge. The emperor told us we were fighting for Japanese spirit against American materialism. But I'm learning that Japanese spirit, as we defined it, was often just cruelty justified by ideology, while American values, the ones we mocked as weak, include actual spiritual strength. The strength to treat prisoners well, even when vengeance would be easier. The strength to sing for enemies on your holy day. The strength to seek understanding rather than just victory. I can never go back to believing what I believed before. That version of me is dead. I'm being rebuilt by these small kindnesses, a chocolate bar from a guard, medical care for my wounds, a Christmas carol sung in broken Japanese by a grandmother who wanted prisoners to feel less alone. I don't know what I'm becoming, but I know it's something different from what Imperial Japan tried to make me. Something more human, maybe. Something that can acknowledge enemies as people while still recognizing the horror of war. If I survive to return to Japan, I'll carry this knowledge home. I'll tell anyone who will listen that the Americans aren't demons, that their strength isn't weakness, that the code we followed, death before dishonor, was itself dishonorable because it refused to acknowledge that enemies can be human. I don't expect people to believe me. Don't expect Japan to accept this truth easily. But it's the truth nonetheless, and I can't unknow it.
In early 1946, the camp administration began offering educational programs. American authorities recognized that Japanese prisoners would eventually return home and wanted them to understand democratic principles, hoping they might become advocates for peaceful reform. Classes were voluntary. Many prisoners refused, saw them as propaganda, as attempts to brainwash them into betraying Japan. But others, including Takeshi, attended. He was curious, and curiosity had become his primary emotion now that fear had subsided. The classes covered American history, government structure, economics, and civil liberties. They were taught by American officers and civilian volunteers, usually through translators, with opportunities for discussion and questions. Takeshi learned about the American Revolution, how colonists had rebelled against monarchy and established government by consent of the governed. Learned about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the concept that government serves citizens rather than citizens serving government. Learned about abolition, women's suffrage, labor movements, the messy, ongoing American struggle to expand liberty and equality.
It wasn't propaganda in the sense of presenting America as perfect. The instructors acknowledged slavery, acknowledged the internment of Japanese Americans during the war, acknowledged ongoing racial inequality. They didn't pretend American history was unblemished, but they presented it as progress, imperfect, halting progress toward ideals of human dignity and equal rights. This honesty shocked Takeshi more than propaganda would have. The Americans were teaching prisoners about their own failings, admitting injustices, presenting their nation as a work in progress rather than a completed achievement. This kind of self-criticism would have been unthinkable in Imperial Japan, where questioning national mythology was treasonous. One instructor, a history professor from Madison named Dr. Catherine Simmons, discussed the difference between authoritarianism and democracy with particular clarity. She explained, through a translator, in authoritarian systems, the individual exists to serve the state. Your value is measured by your obedience, your willingness to sacrifice for national goals. The state defines truth, and questioning official truth is betrayal. In democracies, the state exists to serve individuals. Government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. Citizens have rights that government cannot violate. And crucially, truth isn't defined by authority. It's discovered through free inquiry, debate, the messy process of people disagreeing and working toward understanding. Neither system is perfect. Democracies can be chaotic, inefficient, paralyzed by disagreement. Authoritarian states can be efficient, focused, capable of mobilizing resources quickly. But here's the key difference. Democracies correct themselves. When we make mistakes, citizens can speak up, organize, demand change. Authoritarian states can only correct themselves through collapse, because internal criticism is forbidden. Japan built a system that demanded absolute obedience to the emperor, absolute acceptance of national mythology, absolute submission of individual conscience to state directives. That system led you into a war you couldn't win, continued fighting long past the point where victory was possible, and sacrificed millions of lives rather than admit error. Because error couldn't be admitted, the system had no mechanism for self-correction except total defeat. This analysis cut Takeshi to the bone, because it was true. Japan had continued fighting for months after any rational assessment showed the war was lost. Had sacrificed Okinawa,
had allowed atomic bombs to fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had prepared civilians for suicidal resistance to invasion, all because the system couldn't admit mistake without collapsing entirely.
He thought about the officers who told him death was preferable to surrender, about the propaganda that insisted Japanese spirit would overcome American material advantage, about the absolute certainty, the religious certainty, that Japan's cause was just because the emperor said it was just. And he thought about how different things might have been if Japan had been capable of self-correction, if citizens could have questioned whether the war was winnable, if generals could have recommended surrender without fear of assassination, if the nation could have admitted error before 2 cities were destroyed by atomic fire. After class, Takeshi approached Dr. Simmons through a translator and asked, "If I go home and tell people what you've taught me, they'll call me a traitor. How do I live with that?" Dr. Simmons considered her answer carefully. "You live with it by knowing that truth is more important than comfort, that bearing witness to what you've learned is more valuable than being popular, that Japan needs people willing to question the old certainties so the nation can build something better from the ruins. You're not betraying Japan by learning these things. You're preparing to help Japan heal. That's not treachery, that's patriotism of a deeper kind than unthinking obedience ever was." The letters home, trying to communicate the uncommunicable. When mail service to Japan resumed, Takeshi wrote to his parents. He'd learned they'd survived the war. His father had been too old for conscription, and his mother and younger sister had evacuated from Tokyo before the firebombing. They were living in his mother's family village, struggling like everyone in occupied Japan, but alive. Writing that letter was the hardest thing Takeshi had ever done. How could he explain what he'd experienced? How could he convey that the enemy he'd fought to kill were treating him with more dignity than his own military had? How could he tell his parents, who'd sent him to war with pride, who'd raised him to revere the emperor and the military code, that everything they'd believed was built on lies? He wrote carefully, knowing censors would read every word on both the American and Japanese ends. December 1946. Mother and Father, I am alive, and in America as a prisoner of war. I'm being treated well, perhaps better than I deserve. The Americans provide adequate food, shelter, medical care. I'm learning English. I'm taking classes in American history and government. I'm trying to understand how we reached this point. I know you must be ashamed that I surrendered rather than dying honorably. I'm ashamed too, but I'm also learning that maybe the code itself was wrong, that maybe survival isn't dishonorable when death serves no purpose except satisfying an ideology that led us to ruin. The Americans aren't what we were told. They're not demons or savages. They're people, complex people, flawed people, but people trying to follow principles of human dignity and justice. They've shown me more kindness than I expected, more than propaganda said was possible. I don't write this to praise the enemy or diminish Japan's suffering. I write it because I think we need to understand what happened to us, why we fought a war we couldn't win, why we sacrificed so much for leaders who couldn't admit error.